Hey there, John Morris here, and in this video I'm going to walk through how to create a login system using PHP. So to just kind of set the scope for this video, this is dealing specifically with a login area. We're not getting in necessarily into, getting into a CMS or a social network yet. But with this, I'm just going to show you how you can create a system where you can create a protected area that only logged in members can access, and how, of course, to set up a registration form and a login form, and how to do some make it more than just a simple system. Make it something you could actually get to the point where you use. Now, a couple caveats with all that going forward. First, you are going to get access to the code for this, but I want to be clear that it's not designed to be used on a production site. Okay, it hasn't been through the testing, it hasn't been through the development that you would need to put it through in order to use it on a production site. Now, I'm not saying that the code that we're using isn't valid, or there's something wrong with it, or it's not a good system, but no matter how well you write something the first time, you always have to put it through major testing and development before you put it on a production site. This simply hasn't been put through that, and the reason is because it's not designed for you to take this script and start using it on your site. The script is for you to learn from and learn PHP. So I created this script simply for this tutorial video, so I could show you one way that you could go about doing this. The reality is there's 100 different ways that you could do it. There's probably, well, there definitely is still things, and we'll actually talk about that you'd want to do with this script before you put it on a production site. But it's going to give you a really good example of how to use everything that we've talked about thus far in this PHP course. It's going to give you a really good example of how to kind of start bringing that all together and show you how PHP comes together to create something like this. Okay, so I want to be clear on that. Don't take the script and just put it on a site and assume that that's all you have to do. The point of this script is for you to learn PHP from it, not to use it on a production site. Okay, that said, what you're going to learn is more than just probably what you've seen when you've seen a login tutorial or system where you see something that's very basic. As you see, this is actually set up so that it can be developed further, and it is fairly advanced in some of the things that it does. So you're going to get a really good lesson in PHP through this. Okay, so also another caveat to that is, again, we're not spending too much time on what's actually inside the protected area. Okay, we're more focused on the registration process and the login process, and that's what this is going to be about, and this is going to show you some different ways to do that. Okay, so that said, I want to give you a kind of a broad overview of what we're going to be covering, and I guess another thing to keep in mind is that this video is going to be long. I try to keep my videos short so that they're not just really hours upon hours of having to stare and listen, but there's really no way to do this video and shorten it. Okay, to really get everything out of it, it's just going to be a long video, so stick with me. I think by the end of this video, you're really going to have an advanced understanding of how PHP works and some of the things that you can do and how to do it specifically. So alright, so that said, I want to give you an overview of what we're working with here. So the first thing is that we have our folder with our files. Okay, and so I want to cover a number of the files that we have. First, we have our config file, and I'm going to show you all these files here in a minute. That's essentially going to have our configuration information. The two big things that are in there is the database information and our salts. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit as far as the salts, but the database information, it allows us to put it in a config file. We can include that config file into our scripts, and then we can just put it into our functions for getting data from the database. So we're not always having to re-enter our database information. Okay, so we put that all in a config file. We have our index page, which is actually our protected page, and I'll show you that in a minute. We have our load page, which actually loads all of our include files. You see we have this jincludes folder. This load file, actually, we create it and we put all the includes, necessary includes in it. So then in our our login.php, our register.php, our index.php, we can just include this one load.php file, and it will include all our other includes that we need, instead of having to include those separately in each one. And I'll show you that. So that's what this one does. And of course we have our login.php page, which is our login page, and we have our registration page, which you're looking at right now. Okay, so those are those pages. And then in our jincludes file, we have our class, which is essentially the main functions of the of this script. And then we have our database class, which is everything for connecting with, interacting with the database that we use inside the script. Okay, so those are the files that we have. Now, I want to show you a little bit about the database now. And so, when I was creating this, I wanted to give it some sort of name. It really means nothing. I called it Jumbo. Really came from Joomla and Mambo, kind of smashed together. It's my little attempt at humor, but anyway, that's what I called it. It's really not anything actual, it's just something I made up. But we have this database called Jumbo, and then we have inside that a table called JUsers. And so we'll go ahead and go into this JUsers, and you can see our structure here. We're just collecting some really basic data for the purposes of the script. Of course, for you, if you were to actually build this out, there's probably a lot more things that you would want to collect about a user when they register, and we'll talk about how you can add all that stuff. But we're generating the user ID. Each user gets a unique user ID. We have the username, user login, user pass, user email, and user registered. Okay, so that's the database, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that are going on in here in a minute. And then, as far as the actual script itself, how does it work? So we're going to come in here, and I'm just going to create a new user. As you notice in the database, we don't actually have any records. There's no records in there right now, so we're going to create one. Alright, so that's all our information, and we're going to register. And then you see it says your registration was successful, please log in. And I'm going to use, and actually before I do that, now we come here, and if we go back to JUsers, you can see that now what we get is we have our information about our user. Now you see this is ID 31. That's because I did a whole bunch of testing when I was creating this. So obviously we're down to 31 as far as users. Doesn't really matter. Username is the username I entered. Login. The pass is a quadruple hashed secured salted pass, and I'll show you how to do all that. This is really important. So if someone gets access to this database for some reason, they're still not going to have the user passwords, because all those passwords have been hashed and salted and protected, so that it would take them millions of years to crack this password. And we're going to show you some of the ways that you do that. I have my email, and then I have a Unix timestamp of when I registered. Okay, so obviously again you would may want to collect more information than that when you do yours, but that's what we're using for the purposes of this script. Alright, so I'm going to log in with the John Morris account I just created, and log in, and you can see here that now I'm inside the members area. It has my name, my username, my email, and I converted the Unix timestamp to a readable date for when I registered. And then we say this is members only area, only logged in users can view this page, please click here to log out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out, and you can see it says you have been successfully logged out, and I'm going to go try and visit that index.php page without being logged in. And as you can see, it redirects me to the login page, and it says you must be logged in to view this content. Again, I log in, and I'm back inside the members area, that same index.php page. Okay, so now I'm going to go and register another account just so you can see there's nothing funny going on here. Oops. Alright, register. And again, we have a new record, the one I just created, and now I'm going to log in with that account. And now you can see it pulls that information. Okay, so effectively we have a login system that will protect our index.php page or any page that we put the necessary code into, and it will allow them to register, allow them to log in, and it'll display a little bit of information about them. And then of course, you know, the more information you gather, the more you can display. So really, if you think about sites like Facebook and MySpace and, you know, even like WordPress and Joomla and Mambo and some of the stuff that they use, this is really kind of the core of what they're doing. They're allowing users to register, collecting data about the users, and then displaying that information in some way. Of course, they collect a whole lot more information. They collect, you know, WordPress is about publishing content, Facebook's about interacting with people. You know, they do it all in different ways, but at its core, this is really what those sites are doing. So when you get this, you kind of have that base foundation for creating something like what they've done and creating something of your own. Okay, so and not only that, but you get a real good understanding of how those particular sites work. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to dive in and we're actually going to go through kind of the setup and the code. So the first thing I want to do is just take a look at the database. And so of course I created a database. I created a table inside that database, and then I just created these fields here, okay? And so there's really nothing too special about what I did here. The only couple things that you may want to look at, of course, is this ID field. The big thing here is that it's auto-incremented. So if we go back to the data, you notice that every time I add a new user, it automatically adds it. That's how you give each new user a new user ID. So you have a unique way of identifying every user that signs up for your site, which is pretty important because that's how we're going to pull data about each user based off their user ID. Because, you know, somebody may have the same name, typically not going to have the same email, so you could use email, but it's typically better for you to just assign them their own ID, and then you're guaranteed that they have their own unique way of designating them in your system. So there's that, and then again, the big thing here is just setting it up so it auto increments. The username, we're using variable character. We're setting it to 100, which is, you know, your username is much more than that, then it's probably a little too long. User login, the same, is variable character set to 60. The one that you're going to want to pay attention to here is the user pass. Now, the way that we hash our passwords when we store them in the database, it needs to be 128 characters long, and that's simply because the hash that we're going to use will create a hash up to that long. So we need to make sure we can fit that hash inside of this particular field, okay? So you need to make sure that's 128, or whatever hashing system you end up going with, make sure your field's long enough to hold it. We have the variable character 100 here, again for the email, nothing too special there. And then for the user registered, okay, there's a couple different ways that we could do this. You can actually set this as a date time function and store an actual date time in this field as opposed to the Unix timestamp. However, MySQL has a very particular way that when you use that date time type, remember these are all field types, when you use that date time type, it has a very specific way that it wants it formatted. And PHP doesn't automatically work based on that. Okay, PHP uses Unix. So you have two different systems that use two different methods for storing date and time. So essentially what you'd have to do if you want to use a date and time type is you'd have to have PHP convert it to the correct type for you when you store it in the database, and then when you pull it out of the database, you'd have to have it, you know, back converted or reconverted back to the Unix timestamp so that you can use it in PHP. Now, you could do that, and a lot of systems do. In fact, I was looking at the WordPress database, and they do as far as their user registrations. They store it as a date time type. Again, that's really just a personal choice, up to you. They probably have reasons for why they do that. I don't know what they are, but for me, it's easier just to store it as a unit timestamp, especially for a demo like this. So when you do that, then you don't want to put this as date time, because MySQL isn't going to recognize it. It's not going to let you insert it because it's not properly formatted. So you just say this is like a big int, an integer, and put that timestamp in there, and you'll be good to go. Alright, so that's a little bit about the database. Really, there's nothing too complex about this database. It's really, really simple, but that's a little bit about it. Alright, so now what we want to do is get into the nuts and bolts of this, and we want to cover the code. Alright, so again, we have our register, our login, our index, our config, our load, our class, and our database. So I'm just going to kind of go through these in order here. Alright. Okay, so our config file is really pretty simple. Again, as I mentioned, we have our database details, and we're just defining those as constants so that we can use them throughout the script. So our database name is Jumbo, our database user is a login user, our database pass is this, and so that's all our database information. Again, if you were to fully build this out, you may do something with the collation and some other things in there, the character set. You may have some stuff with that. I didn't really do that with this. And again, if you were to fully develop this, that may be something that you want to look at. But essentially, this would be the one place where your user, if you were to use this script, you'd come in and you'd edit this for your specific site. And you've probably done this before in the past. So you'd come in and you'd put in the credentials for your particular database. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Then we have our salting information. Okay, so we have a couple different salts here. One, we have our site key. Okay, and our site key is unique to our site. Okay. And so what that essentially does is it creates when we go to hash and we start talking about hashing passwords, we want something that's unique to our site. So if someone installs it on their site and then you install it on your site, you each have a different site key. And the reason you want that is because one of the main ways that somebody would attack your password in the database, because a lot of people think, and I'll show you this, you would probably think this password right here is completely secure. There's no way that could be hacked. Like, it makes no sense. But that's actually not true. This password can be hacked. In fact, every hash can be hacked given enough time. Now, when you hash something, what you really do is you increase the amount of time or resources necessary for someone to crack it. So, you know, if someone were to try to brute force attack this, which a brute force attack is when they essentially, you know, they know that it's 128 characters. They go through and they try every possible character combination that exists in the world. And if they had enough time, they would eventually get the right combination, right? So it is crackable, but based on current technology, doing a brute force attack on 128-bit hash would take, I think it was something like 5 million years or something like that. So all you're really doing is pushing it past what is a feasible amount of time for someone to crack it. Okay. Well, what happens is if you use the same site key and this particular script gets installed on, say, thousands of sites, for, like, we'll say WordPress gets installed on millions of sites, and you have the exact same site key on every single one of those keys, what someone could do is create a rainbow table, which is basically where they take and they analyze all the different hash passwords that are stored using that site key. And because there's so much data then available, they can look at it and they can come up with what the password would be, how it's being hashed, or what the hash is. And once they have, you know, the site key and how it's being hashed, then they can use that to back convert it to what the original password is. Anyway, that's called a rainbow table. Okay, and so a rainbow table takes it where it may take 5 million years to where, you know, it may take 2 hours. Okay, because of the way it works. Now, when you create a unique site key, you essentially eliminate the possibility for them using a rainbow table, because they can't create, every site that has this particular script installed has a different site key. So there's no way for them to look at all those sites, analyze that data, and create a table of possible hashes. Okay, so essentially that's you eliminate them being able to use a rainbow table. They would essentially have to use a rainbow table, create a specific rainbow table just for your site. Now, if you have a high profile site, someone may do that, okay, but that's when we're going to start talking about our nonces and our authorization salt down here, okay. So that's what the site key does. The nonce salt is stands for number used once. This essentially allows us to create not only are we hashing our password based off a unique key to our site, but we're going to create a nonce, or a number used once, that based off of this salt that is created for each new user that signs up. Okay, so the hash, if we come back to our database, this hash password, the hash that is used to hash this password is different for every user that's created. Okay, so now not only have you eliminated them being a hacker being able to create a rainbow table for your script, and they'd have to do it specifically for your site. Now if they wanted to create a rainbow table, they'd have to create it specifically for each user. So if they cracked the hash for, say, John Morris, they couldn't go and apply that same hash to Jason Morris and crack his password, because it's a different hash that's used for each user. And so now you've pretty much completely eliminated the value of using a rainbow table, because it won't benefit them anymore. The one thing that you're left with, that a user, well, the two things that you're left with that a user could do are a dictionary attack and a brute force attack. As we mentioned, with a 128-bit hash, a brute force attack is pretty much out of the question, and a dictionary attack, well, a dictionary attack can always be done. That's really the big one that people use, and that comes down to how secure the password that each user creates is. And so then you can just create some simple rules in your registration form for when a user creates a password that allows them to help fight against a dictionary attack. And a dictionary attack is basically what that is. And just to say here, I know I'm talking a lot about this, but when you're talking about a registration and login system, this is really the nuts and bolts. This is keeping it secure. 90% of what you're going to do in here is keeping it so it can't get hacked. Okay, so that's why we're talking so much about this. So with a dictionary attack, the way it works is essentially there's a program that will submit a username and password to your login form over and over and over using different username password combinations. And what a dictionary attack is when instead of using every possible character combination that's out there, what it does is it takes words that are in the dictionary and uses common wildcards. For example, you may have a password that is dog, and you substitute a 0 for the O. Well, that's a common thing that hackers know that people do. Okay, so it will go through every word in the dictionary. It will insert some of those common substitutions. Also, you can have it where it'll append numbers and character combinations on the end of the dictionary word or at the beginning, and it can use all these different combinations. And since you're going based off the dictionary, you're not using every possible character combination. You're using common words and common phrases, so it cuts down on the amount of time required to hack that password. And so instead of 5 million years, you might be talking about 2 or 3 weeks. Okay, and it makes it a little bit more feasible. Okay, well, a dictionary attack, because they're not trying to crack the hash on your site, they're just constantly resubmitting your form and submitting a different character combination. You can't really, the only way that that can really be protected is how your user creates their password. Most people will use, either words that are common to them, that that are involved with their life, or a maiden name or their dad's name, or whatever, some combination like that. Or they'll use a word that's in the dictionary. They'll put in some numbers and special characters, and they'll think they're safe. But the reality is that for a hacker, they know that you're going to do that. So if you're using a word that's in the dictionary, then it makes it a lot easier to crack. So one thing that I recommend you do when you are creating passwords is do something like this. Either you can just type some random keys in your keyboard, which is probably the safest, or you can use something like this, which is a random string generator. Okay, and you come in here and you put in your options, and you say get strings, and it's going to create these just random strings for you. Okay, so you can copy this, and then you could add some special characters to it and make it a little bit longer or whatever. But you'll notice that nothing about this is going to be in the dictionary. Nothing about this has anything to do with you. Okay, this is completely random and pretty much is going to make it so that it's I don't want to say impossible completely, but nearly impossible for somebody to hack because it has nothing to do with you. It's not in the dictionary. Someone would have to literally brute force attack this password, which again would take them millions of years to do. Okay, so that is kind of the skinny on security with your login system, and that's what all of these have to do with. And I'll show you where we use these. We're going to use kind of go over the top a little bit with how we salt everything, but it's very important. So that's what all this salting information is for. These are called salts. Okay. All right. So that's our config file. The next thing we have is our database class. Okay. And we have this Joomba database. If it doesn't exist, create this class. This is how you create a class, and we've kind of covered that. And then inside this class, we have a couple of different functions going on here, or methods. Okay, so I'm going to start down here. We have our connect, we have our clean, we have our hash password, we have our insert, and we have our select. Okay, so essentially what these different methods allow us to do is to connect to our database, to clean data from a form submission, to hash our password, to insert data into a database, and to select data from a database. And of course you can see all the descriptions here. And so we're going to talk kind of on a macro level a little bit about this at first. Now, one thing that I've done with this database class is I've made it so that when you call the database class, when you instantiate it like I do down here, it automatically connects to the database that you've set in your config file and selects or connects to the server and then selects the database that you've set here in your config file. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, that's where we can use this construct function that we have in here, and this is it's really a special method that comes with PHP 5. And what this essentially does is when you specify this construct method, it will automatically run every time this class is instantiated. Okay, so anything that you put inside this function will automatically run when you instantiate it, and that's perfect for automatically connecting us to the server and selecting the database. Okay, so you'll notice that in this construct method, I reference our connect method, and then down here in connect, what we do is we create a link to our database using our database information. So again, this is how you connect to a database using MySQL Connect, localhost, the user, the password. Then we do a check to make sure that the link is valid. If it's not, we kill the script. Then we have our database that we select, MySQL select database, the database name, and we reference our resource link that we created up here. Again, if the database selection doesn't work, we kill the script and return an error. If it does, we just let it continue. So essentially what that does, again, is every time this is instantiated, then it will connect to the database right here, and it will connect to the server and select the database that we want to work with, okay, which is our Joomba database. All right, so that's pretty cool stuff. This up here, this is basically for backward compatibility with PHP 4. In PHP 4, there was no construct method like this. So if you wanted to have something automatically run on when you instantiated the class, you created a function that had the exact same name as the class. Okay. And so essentially what we've done is we've done that, and then we just tell it to run our construct function. So if someone's running PHP 4 and they instantiate this class, it'll kick through to run this, and this will point then kick through to run our construct, which will then kick through to run our connect. So it essentially does the same thing. It's just backward compatibility for PHP 4. All right, so that's a little bit about our database class. Now, down here, our clean function. Essentially what we're doing is we're doing an array map. So an array map allows you to apply a function to every element in an array. Okay, so what we're applying is we're applying this MySQL real escape string to every element in our array. So you'll see when we use this in the class that when a form submission comes into our script, the first thing that we do is we run it through this clean function. So our post data is going to get run, every element in the post data, which is essentially every item in the form submission, is going to get run through this MySQL real escape string and then returned back to the script cleaned. Okay, essentially MySQL or the MySQL real escape string will go through and it'll add slashes and deal with characters that could be dangerous. Okay, so that's our clean function for our database data. All right, so creating a secure hash. This is something we talked a lot about, and so we've created a function that will do that for us. This hash password function. What you do is you pass the password that you want to hash, and you pass in the nonce that you want to hash it with. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And essentially, what it does is it runs it through this function called hashmac, and we're using this SHA 512, one of the more secure ones that you can use. Again, we're hashing the password, so we have the password plus the nonce plus our site key. Okay, so we're actually using two different salts to hash this password, and one, as you'll see, is actually particular to the user when they submit, not only the user but the time that they submitted as well. And then we have our site key again that we talked about. And again, this returns the secure hash. Next, we have our insert function. In it we pass the link to, and this is from our connect function. We're going to pass in the link that we create to the database. We're going to pass in the table we want to insert data to, the fields we want to insert into, and the values we're inserting. Okay, so as you can see here, what we do is we actually, you'll notice that the first one is a resource, which is the MySQL resource link. The second one is a string, because it's the name of the table. The last two are arrays, the fields and the values. So we're passing in arrays to this function, and then we're going to implode the data. And essentially what that does is it takes all of the items that are in that array and turns them into a string, and we can add in a separator, which is a comma and a space in this particular setup. So if we were to go to our register.php page, name, username, password, email, and there's a hidden one, which is the registration date. Those are all the elements in our post array. Okay, so when we want to pass those into MySQL, what we do is we implode them. So this implode will create a string that has the it has the field, and the field will be, you know, username, whatever those values were, name, username, password, email, and registration date. And then the values will be the actual values that we fill in here, like John Morris. Okay, and so what that allows us to do is, as you know, with MySQL, we have to create when we insert data, we insert the field, we tell it what fields and the values to insert it to, and it goes in order. So if we put in our fields here, we have username, or name, username, email, password, registration date. The values have to correspond to that. The first value in this string before this comma has to be the name, and then the username, the password, the email, and the registration date. Okay, they have to be in the exact same order as the fields. All right, so essentially what this allows us to do is it allows us to create that based off the array that gets submitted, so we don't have to do a whole bunch of messing with it. We can essentially have PHP do all the work by imploding that data into strings that are formatted properly. Then we create our SQL statement, insert into our table. Right, here's a variable. We're inserting the ID field automatically. You need to make sure and put this in there, you know, because the ID field exists in the database. what will happen is if you don't put this ID field in here, it'll try and insert the first value here, which in this case is our name. It'll try and insert that into the ID field. Okay, well, the ID field is an integer and our name is a string. So if you try and put that string type into the integer type, MySQL is not going to accept it. Okay, so you just need to put in this ID, and you notice over here we have a corresponding value of blank, because it's going to automatically do it for us. Okay, it's just something with MySQL you have to do. So you put the ID, and you put a blank value here, and then comma, and then our imploded string of all our fields, and then our imploded string of all our values. Okay, so again, when I say implode, this is going to look like something like this. This will be literally will be name, username, password, email, reg date. Okay, and then this will literally be John Morris, password, fake at, whatever the email, and the date. Okay, this will literally be these values. So again, they have to match up exactly with one another. And so that's essentially, we're just forcing PHP to do all that work for us. Okay, so the big thing with this is get in there and play with it. It may not make complete sense just sitting here watching it, so get in there and play with the code. Alright, so we've created our SQL statement, and then we're going to actually run the query using MySQL query, passing in our SQL statement, and if it all goes through kosher, or if it doesn't go through kosher, we're going to kill the script and return the SQL error. If it does, we're going to return true, so that way in our script later on we can check whether or not the insertion of data actually went through properly, and do some stuff if it did or didn't. So that's our insert, and then we have our select down here. Again, we're going to pass in our SQL statement here, and there's reasons why we do that, and as opposed to formatting it inside the actual function, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But we pass in our SQL statement, and this one's really easy. We essentially just run the MySQL query, and then we return the results. And basically what's going to happen is with MySQL query, if the query runs successfully, then it's going to return true, and if it doesn't, it's going to return false. So pretty simple. So we return those, and then again we can run a check on that, and then finally we instantiate our class. Okay, and the reason we do that at the end of the script, so that anywhere we include this script, for example, we're going to include it, well actually it's in our load page here. Anywhere we include this database class, it's going to automatically be instantiated, so we don't have to constantly instantiate it in every script that we create. It'll be automatically instantiated. So when we include it into load.php, and then it's instantiated, and then we include load.php into this register page, our database class is automatically instantiated, so we can just start using it. You notice I just start using it. I don't have to instantiate it. Okay, I can just start using it because it's already been done. Okay, so that's why we do that. Okay, so that's a little bit about the database class and how it works. It's essentially just some functions, a library of functions that allows us to connect with and interact with our database, and then a couple helper functions, this clean and this hash password, so we don't have to constantly recreate all this code. We can just send our password and our nonce to this function, and it'll hash it. We can send our array to this function, and it'll clean it for us. Okay, so really this is pretty simple. If you look at some other database classes, they're quite a bit longer than this because they do a lot more things, a lot more advanced. And of course, again, this isn't meant to be fully developed, so as you develop this, you would definitely be adding to this class here. And our next one is our actual Joomba class. Okay, and there's a couple of primary things that this class needs to do. Okay, so we'll cover what those are. One is the register. So we have a registration page. We need to actually process the registration data. So that's what the register function does. Then we have our login. Again, we need members to be able to log in, so we need to process our login form. So that's what that function does. Then we need to log out. Okay, so we have that in here. And then we need to check our login. Okay, so we need to check to make sure that the person trying to access our index.php is logged in and they have a valid login and all that stuff. Okay, so those are the four main things that we do with the script, and those are the four methods that we have in here. And then again, we instantiate it when we're done for the exact same reason, so we don't have to constantly instantiate it. We just include it and it's already ready to go for us. Okay, so this is our main class that does the bulk of what we do. Okay, and we're going to talk more about this in just a minute. Then we have our load.php. As I talked about, this file essentially includes, we can come in here and we add in any includes we need, and then we just include this file into all of our different pages, and it will then pull in all these files as well. So it like recursively includes. So you don't have to constantly be adding all this to the top of your pages like this. You can just include this one file and they're all in there. And as your scripts get more complex, that's going to become really important, because you're going to have a lot more includes that you're going to be putting in, and if you're having to constantly figure out where to include them and if they were included and this and that, it can get really confusing. So if you just have one file that does all your includes for you and you just have to include that one file into your actual pages, it makes it a lot simpler. Alright, so then we have our register, our login, and our index PHP page. Okay, so we'll talk about these really briefly as far as the HTML that's going on here. You'll notice that for the login page, I require the load, and then I run, or the register page, I run this register function. Okay, for the login page, I require the load .php, and then I run the login function. And then for the index page, again, I require load and I run the check login function. Okay, so essentially, for each one of these pages, we're calling the specific ones that we need from the class: the register method, the login method, and the check login method. And you'll notice actually on the index.php page, we have a logout on here somewhere, but it creates it does the logout for us as too. So we're actually just using these specific methods from our class. Okay, so the bulk of what's happening is going on inside of this class. Okay, so let's talk about the registration. So what happens is that when someone comes to our site and they try and view this index.php page, it redirects them to the login page. And again, we'll show you, and that's using the index or the check login function, but it's going to redirect them to the login page, and then we have this link for this register here. Okay, and they enter their information. Okay, so what happens is that data gets stored in the post variable, and it gets sent to, if we look at our code here, our form submits to itself. Okay, and then inside of our form we call our register function, and then our register function is designed to grab that post data and do something with it. Okay, so we'll come down here and we'll start with where it's going to make most sense. Okay, so we have our post data that just got submitted on our form. So the first thing we're doing is we're just checking to see if the post actually has data, right? Because someone may land on this page without having, right here I haven't submitted any data. So we need to know the state in which the user is hitting this page. Are they hitting this page having entered data, or are they hitting this page having not entered data? So we just run that check right here. If it's not empty, meaning there's data in that post, then we're going to do all this stuff here. But if it is empty, then we're really just not going to do anything. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to display the register.php page where they can register. However, if there is post data, then we're going to do a couple things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a security check. We're going to make sure that the post data that's being submitted to us came from our site, okay? And this is especially important for the register form because you don't want someone spoofing your form and putting on their site and then just running a whole bunch of spam registrations and you getting a bunch of false registrations to your site. So we want to make sure that the post data that's being submitted came from our website and our registration form. Okay, so the way that I do this, and there's lots of different ways that you can do this, but essentially is I get the URL of the current page, okay, and the current page is going to be register.php. Okay, so that's the page. We know that that's the page that our form is being submitted on, is our register.php page, because that's how we built it. Okay, so anything other than a form being submitted from our register.php page, we're not going to accept. Now you could actually just come in here and hard code this and put in, you know, yourdomain.com/register.php, and it would work exactly the same. But because this is something, when you're talking about other people putting it on their sites, you don't know what their domain is going to be. So we just pull their domain and we pull the current page that the form is on. And so if it doesn't, if this isn't, this is going to get us the current page that our registrar.php where it's actually located. This is the full URL from the page that the form was submitted from, or the refer. Okay, so these two values should match exactly. They should be the exact same thing. If you'll notice right here, that's what we're checking for. If those two things match, then we're going to go ahead and process the form. But if they don't, we're going to run this. We're going to kill the script and we're going to submit an error message that says your form submission did not come from the correct page. Please check with the site administrator. So that's just a little security check to make sure the form data that we're getting is from our site. Now, there is probably a lot more things that you could do with this, okay, as far as running this check, but it's important that you make sure that the post data came from the form and the site that you want it to come from. Otherwise, you're going to end up with people who will hijack your form and submit a bunch of spam registrations or worse with it. Alright, so now we have that. I actually have this require once database.php I don't need to have in there. That's just a remnant of when I was building this, so that doesn't need to be in there. Here we select our table, so we're identifying what table we want to work with. Here we're creating our fields. Now if you remember from our database class, when we insert data, we need a fields array, okay? Well, we know what the fields are in our database, right? Because we created them. They're these fields that we have here, okay? They're these fields. We created those, so we know what fields we need. So we can actually, we don't have to get tricky with it. We can actually just specify what those fields are. So as you can see, we have username, user login, user pass, user email, user registered. Okay, so that's really simple. We're creating those fields. The thing that we need to get is we need to get the values from the form data from the form that was submitted. Okay, so whatever was filled in here, that's what we need to get. Okay, so you notice the first thing we do is we run our clean function on our post array. So that's going to clean. It's going to run that array map function through the MySQL rule escape string, and it's going to do that for all of the values in our post array, making sure that there's no dangerous characters in there. Alright, so now that we've cleaned it, now what we're going to do is we're going to break it apart into individual values. So we have our username, our user login, our user pass, our user email, and our user reg, okay? And the main reason we did this is so that we can hash our password, okay? We just want our password out from that array. And so we just kind of break it out apart, and now we can access our password directly. Okay, so the first thing we do is we create a nonce using the action, which is registration, the user login, the registration date, and our nonce salt. Okay, so that's our nonce salt that we have right here. And these are kind of the key things that you want to put when you're creating a nonce. Is you want to have the action that's occurring, okay, so that for all the different actions that occur on your site, like registration or login or editing a user, all of those have a different nonce that's created. So it's going to create a different hash, okay? And you'll see in a minute, we can actually recreate all this ourselves because we know how it's put together, because we know the nonce. But for someone who doesn't have access to this code like we do, and doesn't know what these nonce are, and doesn't know what the registration date's going to be, like, it's really, really difficult for them to recreate this. We can create it all in PHP because we know all that stuff, okay? So the action, the user login, okay, this makes this hash specific to this user. This is what essentially eliminates the use of a rainbow table, and by using the user login. So for each user that creates an account, we're creating a different nonce, okay? Not only that, but we're using their username and we're using the date, the Unix timestamp from when they signed up. So it makes it even more unique to that particular person. And then we use our nonce salt that we have here. Then when we come in and we create our password, before we haven't stored anything in the database, we're going to run our hash password, and we're going to pass in our password, and we're going to create in the nonce that we just created. So it's going to create a hash based off of our password and a nonce that was created dynamically as well. Okay, so, and then if you remember from our database class, our hash password, we're using our password, our nonce, and our site key. Okay, so we're adding another element, which is the site key. Okay, so we have a number of different elements that we're using to hash this password that are aimed specifically at eliminating the use of rainbow tables and forcing someone to run a dictionary or brute force attack. Okay, that's really what we're limiting them down as their attack methods. We're limiting them to be able to use those two. Then, since we're using 128-bit password hash, really a brute force attack is kind of out of the question. So the only thing that they have available to them is a dictionary attack, which is the one thing that they'll always have available to them, and that comes down to how complex the user creates their password and how unique it is, which is why we talked about all that earlier. Okay, so as a developer, you've pretty much done everything that you can do to help make sure that your passwords, when they're stored in the database, are secure. Okay, it's really on the user at this point. All right, so now that we've done all that, then we're going to create our array that we need for our insert function. So essentially we just take all this information we broke apart and we put it back together into an array, and this time our password is our hashed password that we created here. And then we run our insert function. We pass in the link, which is the link that was created actually with our when we included our class up here for our database class. So we pass in the link, we pass in the table we want to insert it to, which we specified here. We pass in our fields, which we created here, and we pass in our values, which we just created and recompiled here. Okay, so that gives you then the data that gets inserted into your database. Okay, so we run the insert function. If you remember, on the insert, we either return an error or true. So if we go back to our class, if the insert equals true, then we're basically going to create a redirect where it redirects them to a login page, and we pass this query parameter that says the registration equals true, basically saying, hey, they just registered, and that's how they got redirected here. If the insert function doesn't work, then we're going to kill the script and we're going to return an error. Okay, so that is how our register function works. Essentially, it grabs the post data, it checks to make sure that post data came from where it should have come from. It takes the post data and breaks it apart so we can hash our password. Once our password is hashed, it recompiles it back together, and then it inserts it into the database. And if the insertion of the data happens correctly, then we redirect them to the login page so that they can log in on the account that they just registered with. Okay, so that's what the register function does, and that's the nuts and bolts of how it works. Alright, so now let's talk about our login method here. And if we go to login.php page, you can see how we have our load here. We have this little if statement that if the action equals logout, we're going to run the logout method. But primarily what's going to happen here is we're going to be running the login method. Okay, and so if we go back to our class, this is the login method. It's really similar actually to the register method, because when you're a user and you think about registration and login, you think about it as two different things, because registration, you're submitting data to the database and having it added, okay? But when you log in, you feel more like you're getting data from the database, or you don't really feel like you're necessarily doing the same thing you are with register, but you really are. It's really pretty close, okay? So again, we do this the same way. If you look at the login form down here, it submits to, right here, it submits to itself, okay? So we have everything submitting to itself. And so the first thing that we do in the class, again, is we check to make sure that we're getting post data, right? So if the login form is getting post data, then we're going to run it through all the stuff we need to do to log in. And if it doesn't, then I'm just returning empty right now, which is something that you can use later on if you want to add something. But the main thing that's going on here is if there is post data, then we're going to run it. Now you'll notice that here we don't have the check to see where the login form is getting submitted from, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that a lot of times, like for example, WordPress is a good example. You may have seen a WordPress site where the default login for WordPress is at a page called wplogin.php. Well, you may have seen a login form that's in the sidebar on like the home page of the site. Okay, what happens is that form on that main page actually sends its post data to the login form at wplogin.php. Okay, and so it allows it to send that data and log the user in that way. If we were to run the same check we run on registration here, you wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, and so with login data, it's not quite as important to check the data to make sure it's submitted from this particular from this exact login page, because one, you're not adding any data into the database. Really what you're doing is just checking data, okay, which doesn't mean you still shouldn't be careful, but it means you can be a little bit more liberal with what you're doing. Now if you wanted to lock yours down to where it had to come from your login page, you could run the exact same check that we ran on the register page. Or you could even do a check where instead of making sure it comes from this page, you can make sure it comes from this domain. Okay, so you could do that as well. I chose not to in this particular example, but that's kind of what's going on there, and that's why that's not here on the login form or the login method. Okay, so again, we're checking to see if there's post data. If there is, then again, the first thing we do is we clean that data. You always clean the data, because even in a login form, if someone were to put in some sort of an SQL injection attack, it could still get in and affect your database, even if you're not actually storing that data in the database. Okay, it could allow them to query your database just using your login form. So you always clean the data. So we're cleaning the data, and then from that post data, we get our value, we get our username and our password that was submitted. Okay, these are the ones that the user submitted. Okay, and we're going to check those against the ones that are stored in the database. Okay, so the name of the table we want to select that from, again, is our JUsers table. And then we're going to run our query to get all of the data where in our users table where the username or the user login equals what was submitted. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're querying our database for this username. Okay, and we're going to pull in all of the data for that username. So if we go to our database, when we log in, we query the database for this user login, and when we find it, we're going to pull in all this data. Okay, so that's essentially what makes it so that they have to have a login name, or they have to know the login name, because if they query for a login name that doesn't exist, then our query is not going to return any results. Or if they query for John Morris but enter the password for Jason Morris, it's not going to match up. Okay, so that's essentially what makes that happen. So we query our database for this username, and we pull in all that data, and we store it in a results variable. Again, we check that variable. If you know if it exists, then we're just going to continue. If it doesn't, we kill the script and we say, sorry, that username doesn't exist. There's some more stuff that you could probably do with this. Instead of killing the script, you could probably just have it return a value, and if that value is returned, then have your PHP codes submit an error, a prettier error on your page. However you want to do that, but this is how I chose to do it in this particular setup. Alright, so then we have our results stored as a MySQL resource. The same thing that you always do with MySQL. We're going to fetch it as an associative array, store it again in our results variable. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get some of the specific data we need to rehash our password and check to make sure it matches the one we hashed when they registered. Okay, so we're going to get our registration date, because if you remember from the registration method, we use the registration date to hash the password. Okay, so we need that. We need the stored password. Okay, this is what we're going to check against. So our stored password is stored as this long number here that we hashed. Okay, the password that was submitted is the actual password that you typed in when you created it. For example, in all these examples, the password that I typed in is CHANGEME, C-H-A-N-G-E-M-E. Okay, and if I go to log in, I type in John Morris, and I type in C-H-A-N-G-E-M-E, and I log in, and that's how I log in. So that's the actual password that I typed in, but because it's hashed, it's all these crazy numbers. Okay, so we need to rehash it the exact same way we rehashed it when they registered, and then check the password they submitted versus the password that's stored in our database. Because if let's say I have CHANGEME as my password, and I hash it the exact same way, then the hash that comes out is going to be the exact same. But if my password's CHANGEME and I put in, change you is going to render a different hash. Okay, it won't match the hash that we created with CHANGEME. Okay, because they're two different words, they hash differently. Right, so all we do is that we grab our password from the database that's stored. This is the hashed one that's stored, and then you'll notice we have the exact same line that we have in our registration script, okay, to create our nonce. This is the exact same. The only thing that we did is now we substituted in the submitted name as opposed to the stored name. Remember, subname is the name they submitted when they submitted the login form. We submit in the registration date we grabbed from our database, but we have to grab that because that was part of this hash, and if we try to just grab the current date that we have now, it's going to be different, so it's going to create a different hash. And then we put in our nonce salt. So we essentially do this the exact same way we did when we registered, except we're hashing their submitted name. Then again, that creates our nonce. Then we run this to our hash password to create the actual hash. Again, the exact same way that we did in the registration form. And so what we're left with is two variables. We have a subpass and a stowpass. And basically, this is the submitted password rehashed in the exact same manner we rehashed their password when they entered it on registration. And then we have our stored pass, which is the password they entered on registration. And both of those are hashed the exact same way. And so now if their password that they entered in the login form is the same one they entered when they registered, these two variables should match. And if we come back and we come to our login form, and I type in John Morris, and I'm going to type in 123. I try and register or log in. You see I can't log in because they don't match. Okay, that's how we do that. So that's how we're able to create and store this crazy hashed password yet still be able to check to make sure that and do all these advanced things like registration date and username hashing and make it completely unique, yet at the same time still be able to go into a login form and check to make sure that the password that was entered is the same one that's in our database. So these two variables ultimately should be exactly the same. Now, if this matches, then what we're going to do is we're going to set a cookie, right? And that's an authorization cookie. And that cookie is going to have information that we can check using our check login function. We can check that information to see if it's correct, and if it is, allow that user to continue to stay logged in. And if not, then we're going to destroy the cookie and log them out. Okay, so we're going to create a cookie, and we've talked about cookies before. This is how you actually use it. Okay, so we're going to create an authorization nonce. All right, and you remember from our config file we created this auth salt. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to take now that these two passwords are the same and that user is authorized to log in, we're going to create a cookie and we're going to rehash the password again. Okay, again using this MD5. This time instead of registration though, we're going to use cookie. We're going to use the submitted password. We're going to use the registration date, and this time we're using the authorization salt. Okay, so this time we're hashing it on different variables, so we get a different hash. That way, someone can't look at our cookie and, if they were to steal the cookie, it would essentially give them what's in the database right here if we didn't rehash it. But since we're rehashing it, and again we're using things that make it completely unique, and using a different salt and using a different action right here, it creates a completely unique hash again. Okay, so then our authorization nonce, this is just exactly like what we did when we're hashing our password, the nonce and this hash password function, except this time, we're just changing the values a little bit. We rehash it. Now we have a completely new rehashed version of our password, and we're going to set that in our cookie. Okay, and we're going to set it. We're going to set the we're going to set the user login. Okay, and we're going to set the authorization ID, which is essentially this quadruple hashed password. So we're setting these two cookies. You see, if you remember from the cookies video, we're setting it in an array. Okay, now that we have those cookies set, then we're going to create a redirect, and we're going to redirect the user to our index page, which is our page that they're ultimately logging into. Okay, so that's essentially what this does. So on a macro level, what it does is it checks to make sure there's post data. If there is, it grabs that post data and uses the username to grab information about that user from the database. Then we check the password that was stored in the database versus our password that we rehash in the exact same manner that was submitted in the form. Make sure those two variables match. If they match, then we're going to rehash our password into something that can be stored in a cookie. We're going to set our cookie with the username and the rehash password, and then we're going to redirect them to our index page. Okay, so that's essentially what the login function does. Now, since we're talking about cookies, I want to just show you real quick here. We have our login form, and if you want to look at cookies, at least in Google Chrome, it's options, and then we can go to under the hood, content settings, and all cookies and site data. Okay, and then what we do is we come down here and we look for our site. Now, ours on this particular setup is localhost. Okay, because I'm running this on my local host. So we go to localhost, we go to cookies, and we can actually see the cookies in here. Now, if we go back to our script here, then our cookie has the name of Jumbo log auth. Okay, and if we look, we see we don't have that cookie in here, and that's because I'm not logged in. So if I log in and we go back to our options here and we refresh this and give this a second. Alright, and we're going to go back to our local host, go back to our cookies. You can see that now we have this Jumbo log auth, and we have the log auth ID and the user. So now we have our cookies, okay? And that leads us into our next method, which is the check login. Okay, so the check login is on the index.php page, and any page you want to protect, you put this check login. What it's essentially going to do on a macro level is it's going to check for the existence of these cookies, make sure that those cookies not only exist, but that they are what they're supposed, their values are what they're supposed to be, and then if so, it's going to allow that user to view that page, and if not, it's going to redirect them to the login page. Okay, so essentially we see right here, we're grabbing our cookie array, Jumbo log auth, we're grabbing our values, and we have our username now set as the user variable, and we have our authorization ID set as auth ID. Those are from the cookie. Okay, so we're grabbing the values from the cookie. If the cookie is empty, then we're just going to redirect the user to these pages right here, okay, to our login page, right? If it's not empty, then we're going to query our database for the user that is stored in the cookie, okay? So that's this name right here. This is the one, the person who logged in, it stores their username. So we're going to query the database for that user, and we're going to select the results, all the results for that user. Okay, if that MySQL query doesn't run, we kill the script and return an error. We do our MySQL fetch associative array into our results variable again. Now we get our stored registration data again. We get our stored password, so we can compare it with the password that is stored in the cookie, or the auth ID that's stored in the cookie. And then again, just like we did with the login page, we're going to rehash the password that is stored in the cookie. I take that back. We're going to rehash the password that's stored in the database, because remember, we rehashed the database that was stored or the password that's stored in the database. We rehashed it when we put it into the cookie. So to check the cookie against the stored password in the database, we need to rehash the password in the database. So we're going to rehash the password in the database using the exact same way we did it when we stored in the cookie. Okay, the exact same way, and then we're going to check that against the password that's stored in the cookie. So essentially what this allows you to do is it's checking your cookie to make sure that what's stored in the cookie as your authorization ID, which is your rehashed password, matches what's stored in the database once it's rehashed. Make sure those two values match each other, so that essentially what it keeps someone from being able to do is go in and alter the cookies manually and get access to your site. Okay, they have to know the password in order for them to have access to the protected area here. Okay, so and we just do that by running a check to make sure that the password matches. Okay, so if it does match, then we're going to return true, and if it doesn't match, we're going to return false. And now that we have, and we know that, you know, either the cookies, the authorization ID matches what's in the, you know, what's in the database, that we have a match, this is true, then if we come over to our index.php page, you can see we have this function run, right? And this is going to return either true or false, because that's what we're returning in our class here, is either true or false. And so if false, then we're going to redirect to our login page. If it is not false, or if it's true, then we are going to again grab the cookie and we're going to get the data we need. We're going to query the database, and we are going to get some data about that user that we then will come down here, and you'll see that we display that data about the user, and we essentially allow them to view that page. Okay, so if it's false, they're not going to be able to see the page. They're going to redirect to the login page. If it's true, as far as, you know, redirection or anything like that, we're going to just do nothing. They'll actually be able to load the page, and then we're going to query the database for some data about that user, and we're going to display it in our page down here. Okay, so that's the login method and how it works. The next thing that we'll need to talk about real quick is the log out. And we come back up here. And if you remember from the cookies video, you know that essentially the way that we're going to log someone out is we're going to expire their cookies. So when their cookies then expire, when the check is run to see if those cookies exist, they won't, and they won't be able to access the index.php page until they log back in again. So our login function essentially takes our cookies and it expires them. Now the way we do that is, you'll notice on our index.php page we have a link down here to log out, and what we do is we append this action equals logout query variable or query parameter to the URL. Now if we go to our login page here, because that's the page we're sending them to, you see that we're sending to login.php action equals logout. You notice we have this if statement right here. If the action equals logout, then we're going to call this logout function. So essentially we're sending them to the login page, but we're sending them, when we create that logout link, we're sending them with an action or a query parameter that denotes logging out, and then that is what triggers our logout function to run, and the logout function just expires our cookies, and therefore we're no longer able to access the index.php page. So here we are in our site, and remember we have our cookies here. We're going to click logout, and you'll see I go to login.php action equals logout. If we come back to our cookies, and we go to localhost cookies, you'll see that those cookies no longer exist. And if we try and go to index.php, I can't. I'm redirected to the login page because those cookies don't exist. Okay, so that's kind of how you would set up a login system. Okay, now just a couple more things that you may be wondering. For example, I have this, you must be logged in. I have all these error messages at the top here. Okay, essentially the way I did that, just so you can see, is I have this block of code really right here, and this handles all the messages. Okay, so if logged equals invalid, then we're going to print this error message: username password combination you entered is incorrect. Okay, so if we go to our class, actually, yeah, right here, logged, this is where we get our logged, and it's going to return it's going to return a value, and that value could be a number of things. It could be empty, it could be invalid, or it could just be true. Okay, so invalid happens when the if statement is if these two passwords don't match. If the submitted password doesn't match the stored password, we return invalid. And then on our login page, we can again grab that, and if it is invalid, that means the username password combination you matched isn't correct, and so try again. Here we have reg equals true, and you'll remember from our class on when we do the registration, we have reg equals true appended to our redirect here. So if the reg equals true, it's going to say your registration was successful, please log in. If logged out equals true, then it's going to say you've been successfully logged out. And this is where we get logged out from our JLogout here. Okay, so if that equals true, then again we're going to print that message. And then finally, if on that particular one we actually have an if else, because if the cookies, this actually checks to see if the cookies got deleted, so it checks for the cookies, and if the cookies still exist, then and we have if we have an action of log out, but the cookies still exist, then we're going to say there was a problem logging you out. That means something funky's going on with the script, okay? So that gives you a little bit of a troubleshooting. And then we have this get message equals login, which we have on our index, we have if our logged equals false, which means if our checked login method returns false, meaning they didn't log in successfully, or they're not logged in, then we're going to redirect them to our login page, and we're going to append this message, or this query variable message equals login. So then on the login page, we grab that message, and if it equals login, we put you must log in to view this content. And that's essentially what creates all of our error messages. So you must log in to view this content. Okay, John Morris, wrong password, username password is incorrect. Then we do John Morris, right password, then we log out. You've been successfully logged out. And if we go to register and we go create a new user and we register, your registration was successful, please log in below. Okay, so that's how we create all those messages. Alright, so that's the ins and outs of this login system and kind of how it all comes together and how it works. Now, you'll notice I intentionally didn't go into a whole lot of detail about each particular PHP function. There's a reason for that, and I want to cover this because I'm sure it'll come up. This course, or this lesson, this video is designed to show you how those functions come together in kind of an overall picture to create something specific. If you want to learn more about individual PHP functions, that's kind of what all the earlier videos were for, to show you some of the major ones, to show you how to read the PHP manual so that now you can go back and you can research some of this stuff. I'm going to be straight up with you. When I went to create this login script, every single function, PHP function that I used in here, I didn't know necessarily. Some of them I do because I use them all the time, but I didn't know every single one. I had to go to the manual and research them and get an idea of how I was going to make this all come together. And that's why the first thing you do when you go to write a script is research. It's always the first thing that I do, any coder that I know does, is they research and they look up what functions they're ultimately going to do once they have a broad understanding of how all the pieces are going to come together. Okay, so this is less about the individual functions and how they work, and more about the overall scope and how to bring it together, how to create certain things, how to do hashing, you know, how this whole process of registration and logging in and logging out works as a whole. Then you can go back and fill in the blanks by looking up functions in the manual, starting to write some of this code yourself. And then of course obviously this particular script, if you were going to write something like this, needs further development. You probably want to do some things for the login page as far as brute force attacks, where, you know, if there's 3 submissions within, you know, a 5-minute period on the same username, then you disable the login or whatever, so that someone can't sit there and just repeatedly try and log into your site, that you have some sort of way to check for that and then disable your script if so. You might want to do on the registration form, use the use some sort of spam check, you know, use you know, one of the ones that are available out there that you could add into the script to check for that so that you're not getting spam registrations. You'd probably want to do some stuff with JavaScript on all the forms to check for certain characters or character combinations and not allow those to be submitted. You know, there's just a lot more that you could really do with this, that you would want to do with this before you put it on a production site, okay? But as a learning tool, it's going to show you and give you the code that's necessary to kind of get that broad understanding of how things start to come together, and then you can get creative on your own of how you want to make all this stuff happen yourself. There's probably 100 different ways to do what I've done here, and there's probably 99 of them are probably better than this one, okay? So it's just a matter of you as a developer getting out there, getting creative, working with your site, what you're comfortable with, and making it work for you, okay? So If you have questions about the individual functions that were used in here, go back to the earlier videos. If those functions are covered in those videos, and look at those. Maybe you have questions about cookies again. Go back and look at that. Or if it's not in those videos, then get into the PHP manual and really start digging into it and looking up those functions and reading it. That's really going to help your understanding. Okay. So anyway, that's how to create a login system. That's kind of how it all comes together. That's how you can do it. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and I'll talk to you again soon.